Good evening, my name is Eliomar. I'm 48 years old and I live in Ananindua in the state of Pará. The story I will tell here happened in São Félix do Xingu when I went to live with my beloved grandmother after my grandfather died. She used to tell me many stories about my grandfather, but one in particular always gave me a lot of fear, and I will tell it to you now. So stay with the story of my grandfather and the beast of the full moon. At that time, the main income came from working in livestock farming or on the cocoa plantations, which is where I worked with my brothers and my father. The money was very little, but it was what we had to make do with. Until a friend of my father arrived at our house, talking about working a few days in an illegal gold mine, which was common there and prohibited to this day. But it was only going to be a few days, and we would return with the money from months of work on the cocoa plantations. We were quite in need, and my father and I ended up going with him, leaving my other brothers with my mother at home. The man said that he had spent a month there and had earned good money, and he was returning to earn a little more and settle down. My father and I were suspicious of all the money he claimed to have earned, but even so, we would go there to see with our own eyes. It was a journey of almost 12 hours on foot, as the place was well hidden in the middle of the forest. My father's friend said he knew the way well, as he had been there several times, and we were always suspicious of the story he told us. 1 hour he stopped, saying he was going to relieve himself in the woods, and I stayed with my father, sitting and waiting. That's when he said, "Son, I've become suspicious of this fellow. If anything happens to me, you run and don't stop until you get home." I nodded my head in agreement, and the man returned so we could continue. We walked all day, and as it was getting dark, we arrived at the camp. The problem was that there was no one there. The place was empty, and there were only a few holes in the mud, a river further ahead, and old wooden shacks with their doors open. The man who had taken us there then said, "Could it be that the police found out and they left? Or maybe they moved at the last minute?" My father picked up our things, and we were about to leave, but night was already falling, and going through the forest in the dark wouldn't be prudent. We lit a fire and fixed up one of the shacks to spend the night there, and in the morning we would leave. The man who had taken us kept apologizing to my father every hour, as he really didn't know that the gold mine had ended there. We left the fire burning high near the shacks and went to lie down in one of them. Before I fell asleep, my father said, "I'm going to stay awake while you sleep, and later I'll wake you up so I can sleep. I don't want to close my eyes without you being awake, because I don't trust this man, especially after arriving here." I went to lie down, and my father sat there, letting me sleep for a few hours. That's when I woke up with him very nervous, telling me to get up and get ready. I didn't quite understand what he was saying, but I stood up and asked where his friend was. He then said, "We heard some footsteps," and he got up and ran to see who it was. He ran in the direction of the steps, and that was half an hour ago, and he hasn't returned yet. This fellow is lying in wait for us. Then my father pulled out a machete that was wrapped in some cloths and said, "If he thinks I wasn't expecting something bad, he's mistaken." My father told me to put on my boots and said we were going to the river and stay there. I asked why, but he told me to hurry. So we left our things in the old shack and ran to the river, where the water was at most waist deep. We crouched down near some branches of a tree that was there, and my father stared fixedly at the shack we had been in. More than an hour passed, and I was shivering with cold in that icy water. But I trusted what my father was doing, so I didn't complain. I turned and asked where that wretch had gone to leave us alone here. Then my father gestured for me to be quiet and pointed towards the shack. The moon was full that night, and we saw a huge animal approach and start circling the old shack where we had been. My father grabbed my shoulder, and we crouched down in the water, leaving only our heads above the surface. It was at that moment that the creature let out a scream and knocked down the old wooden door and entered the shack. It was hitting things inside and making those noises that I don't even know how to describe. Then we saw an animal come out and start entering the old shacks that were around. It knocked them down one by one, as if it were looking for us. Now I understood why my father had stayed in the water. We were seeing a werewolf, and if we had stayed in the shack, we would have been torn to pieces. So we stayed the rest of that night watching the demon destroy everything around us, and almost by morning it left. When the sun rose, my father and I grabbed our things and ran, and I kept asking about the man who had brought us. My father just walked silently faster and faster, as if he were fleeing, and I followed him, almost running. We continued along the path all that day, and near nightfall we arrived home. Even without knowing the way, my father followed the trails, and we managed to arrive. Before we entered the house, my father said, "Don't tell anyone what we saw. Let only me speak." I asked about the man who took us. "Father, could he have died?" My father looked at me and said, "The man who took us was the monster we saw." I didn't understand why my father asked for silence about what we saw, but I obeyed him. When we entered the house, he told my mother that the work hadn't worked out, and that we had spent the night there and come back now, in the morning. I asked my father where he knew the man who took us from, and he said, "I always saw him from time to time in a bar where I sometimes went. We weren't exactly friends, we just talked once in a while. I never thought he would take us to the gold, meant to try to harm us, but let's forget about this subject. I don't want your mother to know anything." Many years passed, and I got married and no longer lived with my parents. I started working on a cattle ranch here, where I earned a good salary and had the boss's trust. One day he called me and asked me to choose 2 men to accompany a truck that would take some cattle to another municipality. It was a long trip, 7 hours to go and 7 hours to return. One man would go with the truck driver and I with the other in the car behind. Upon arriving at the destination, we would spend the night there and return the next day very early. We took the road, and on the way, I was driving the car and talking about the farm with one of the oldest employees there. He was an old man who had worked as a carpenter for many years and had seen many things in this life. And as we talked, we got onto the subject of gold mines. And since he was already old, I asked him if he had ever worked in one. And it was at that moment that my past began to resurface, because the man remained silent for a few seconds, and I asked him if he was all right. Then he looked at me strangely and said that when we arrived at our destination, he would tell me why he had been quiet, as it was a long story. I smiled and changed the subject, as it was clear that something had bothered him. When we arrived, we put the cattle in the pen and went to have dinner at the house of the man who had bought the animals. Afterward, he showed us the rooms where we would stay, and when it was time to lie down, I asked the man who had come with me why he had acted so strangely when I mentioned working in gold mines. He then began to speak. Many years ago, my brother and I went to deliver some supplies to a gold mine. As the place was difficult to access, we carried the things on donkeys, as you couldn't get there by car. It was one of those long trips where you go one day and come back the next. When we arrived, my brother delivered the supplies to the person in charge of the mine, and he paid us. We were going to spend that night with them, but one thing we noticed was that the men seemed scared, as if they feared something. I commented to my brother that the place was very quiet and that there was something strange. The person in charge took us to where they prepared the food, and we sat down there. Then he gave us a drink and said, "This gold mine's days are numbered. For some nights now, an animal that we don't know what it is has been attacking us. The men are scared because the creature doesn't seem to be afraid of shots. It keeps walking around the camp and scratching at the doors, haunting everyone here. As you can see, this is hard work, and they need to sleep well to endure it. But with this beast here, it's difficult. We were 30, now we are only 16, and some are already saying that they will leave on the next payday. With less than 10, there's no production, so we're going to end up leaving. What kind of animal is it? I asked, but the person in charge couldn't say, as the creature didn't look like anything he had ever seen in the forests. When night fell, I went to tie the donkeys near where we were going to sleep, and they were quiet, like I had never seen them before. That's when one of the men there said, if I were you, I'd leave them loose. There's a strange beast that appears here late at night, and leaving them tied up is a death sentence. Let them loose, and if they run far away, they'll know the way back. I untied the donkeys, because the man was right. If some beast appeared, they wouldn't have a chance tied up. It was already very late, and one thing caught my attention in the shack I was in. The men were sitting in their hammocks and awake. No one was sleeping. It was as if staying awake was a matter of life or death. I began to fear for my life because the situation there seemed very serious. That's when we started hearing horrible screams coming from the forest, as if someone was dying. I got up and was about to open the door, but one of the men stopped me and said, if you open it, you stay outside, because I'm not going to open it when you ask. I took a step back and just heard that thing running in front of the shack where my brother was. The donkeys outside ran off immediately, and we only saw the shadow through the cracks in the wood. The fire outside provided little light, but it was clear that it was a huge animal. All the men there kept looking through the cracks at the strange animal that was growling outside, and I also went to try to see what it was. But when I looked, believe it or not, there was a wolf that, standing up, was bigger than me, walking on two legs and sniffing the air. I have never seen such a big animal in my life. It rarely walked on all fours. It seemed to know it was being watched and ran from shack to shack, waiting for the first opportunity to attack. That's when my brother said, that's a werewolf, you can be sure. It's a werewolf. The demon spent almost the entire night haunting the gold mine. When the sun rose, the donkeys returned, and my brother and I immediately started getting ready to leave, only we didn't return alone. 15 men returned with us that morning, but one was missing, as the person in charge said there would still be 16 there. So we found out who the beast that was haunting the gold mine was. It was the missing man who turned into the creature and haunted everyone. His name was Mendez. He had only been in the place for a few days, and since he wasn't there, we quickly concluded that he was the one who transformed. We all left, abandoning the gold mine, and I never heard any more news about that place. After listening to the man's story, I told him what had happened to my father and me, and he said that we were very lucky to have survived the ambush. I said that when we returned, I would ask my father what the name of the man who took us to the gold mine at that time was, to see if we were talking about the same person. The next day, I dropped the men off at their homes and went to my father to ask him what the name of the wretch who almost killed us years ago was. He scratched his head, trying to remember, as he was already quite old. Then he said, "Son, if I'm not mistaken, it was Mendez, but why the question?" Then I told my father what I had heard, and it was real. We had been taken to the gold mine by a werewolf, and we should have been dead if my father hadn't been so clever in suspecting the cursed man earlier. Sooner or later, the truth always comes out. There is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, and even if you hide your past, one day it always comes to the surface. That's how we were sure that the man who took us to the gold mine was a werewolf. I don't know if he is still alive or has already died, but pity the one who believes his tall tales. He may not live to tell the story as I am doing now. Good night.